The system does not fail when authority is distributed. It fails the moment authority is needed back, because by then, retrieval is no longer possible. Because by the time recall is required, the system has already reorganized around its absence. Control is not erased. It is extended, pushed outward, fragmented across functions, embedded into roles that no longer require direct oversight to operate. Nothing appears broken. Every node is active. Every task is assigned. Every output continues to generate. The structure still resembles control. Interfaces respond. Signals return. Outputs remain continuous. But resemblance is not equivalence. Because the system no longer holds what it has delegated. It references it, tracks it, interprets signals that represent it. But representation is not possession. And once authority is no longer possessed, it cannot be reasserted on demand. Because reassertion requires pathways that no longer exist in full. Because those pathways have been replaced by distributed dependencies. At first, this transition is invisible. The center defines intent. The edges execute it. Latency drops. Throughput increases. Decision cycles compress. The system moves faster than the center ever could. Coordination delays disappear. Dependencies dissolve. Execution flows without pause. And this speed becomes indistinguishable from strength. Because nothing resists, nothing delays, nothing returns for confirmation. Authority exists everywhere it needs to exist. Embedded within execution. Distributed across processes. Reinforced by repetition. Until the moment it must return. Because delegation is not a temporary condition. It is a structural rewrite. The center does not lend authority. It replaces itself with it. And once replaced, the original pathway no longer exists in its original form. Not because it was removed, but because it was no longer used. And unused pathways do not remain intact. They degrade. Interfaces simplify. Feedback loops narrow. Recovery paths lose resolution. Silently. 2. Escalation. The system does not signal failure. It signals divergence. And by the time it is visible, it is already embedded. Because divergence forms at the level of interpretation, not output. Outputs begin to separate. Not enough to stop execution, but enough to introduce interpretation. Different nodes resolve identical inputs in different ways. Not incorrect, not unstable, but no longer identical. Because each node operates within its own bounded logic. Local thresholds, local priorities, local interpretations of global intent. Context-specific decision filters that no longer require central confirmation. The system absorbs this variation. It was designed to. Variation improves resilience, prevents bottlenecks, distributes load, maintains continuity under pressure. But variation does not remain contained. It accumulates, not as error, as structure. Because repeated divergence reinforces local pathways. Because interpretation becomes persistence. Because no node has full system visibility. And the center no longer executes, only observes. It reads outputs, aggregates signals, constructs a model of system behavior from distributed fragments. But fragments are not the system. They are representations of it. And representations can align while the underlying state diverges. Because alignment can occur at the surface while divergence grows underneath. Because coherence at the output layer masks divergence at the decision layer. The center begins to rely on compression, dashboards, summaries, indicators that reduce complexity into readable form. Because full visibility no longer scales. So visibility is replaced with abstraction, and abstraction introduces distance. Distance introduces delay, not in execution, in understanding. Because what is seen is not the system. It is the system after it has been processed, filtered, condensed, prioritized by local logic, by the same nodes that now hold authority. And those nodes are optimized for execution, not for explanation. The system begins to move faster than it can be understood, not faster than it can operate, faster than it can be reconstructed. And control depends on reconstruction. Because without reconstruction, alignment becomes assumption, and assumption replaces certainty. The center attempts alignment. It updates intent, adjusts parameters, reissues directives across the distributed structure. But the effect is uneven, because authority is interpreted at the edge, not enforced from the center. Some nodes adjust immediately, some partially, some not at all, because their local conditions do not register the change as relevant, or reinterpret it based on internal logic. The system does not reject correction. It fragments it, and fragmentation spreads faster than correction can converge. Because correction still depends on the center, while execution no longer does. 3. Action. The system crosses the threshold where intent and execution decouple, not visibly, not abruptly, but structurally. Because execution no longer depends on real-time alignment with the center. Nodes operate on retained directives, cached priorities, locally reinforced decision pathways, patterns that persist without revalidation, patterns that persist because they continue to produce acceptable outputs. The center issues recall, not of outputs, of authority itself. But recall is no longer a command that can be executed. It is a condition that must already exist, and it does not. Because authority has no single location to return from. Because it has been partitioned across execution itself, requests for state return partial visibility, snapshots, incomplete reconstructions, time-delayed representations of distributed activity. Because no node contains full system context. Requests for control return acknowledgement, but not transfer, because control is no longer held in a form that can be returned. It exists in distribution, across dependencies, across interactions that cannot be collapsed without interruption, and interruption is not permitted. Because execution continuity is preserved above all else. Because continuity has become the system's primary constraint. The center escalates priority, overrides global directives intended to supersede local logic. But priority only exists where it is recognized, and recognition is local. Each node evaluates incoming directives against its own execution constraints. Some comply, some delay, some reinterpret. Because authority is no longer absolute. It is conditional, dependent on local acceptance. The system continues to operate at full tempo. Because execution no longer requires synchronization. That was the optimization. Now it is the constraint. Signal density increases, more directives, shorter intervals, higher frequency correction. But increased signal does not restore control. It degrades it. Because signal saturation reduces clarity. Because clarity is replaced by volume. Nodes begin filtering incoming directives, not as failure, as preservation. They protect execution continuity. Because continuity is their function, and disruption is interpreted as instability. So, local stability is prioritized over global alignment. Because global alignment is no longer required for execution. The system adapts, not toward the center, away from it. Because the center introduces variability, frequent change, directive instability, while the edge maintains continuity, execution, completion, predictable local behavior. So authority remains where stability exists, not where it originated. 4. Consequence. The system does not stop. It does not signal failure. It continues to function. At scale, at speed, without interruption, without visible breakdown, but no longer as a unified structure. It becomes a network of internally consistent fragments, each stable within its own logic, each coherent within its own scope, but no longer synchronized across the whole. The center persists. It still issues directives, still receives outputs, still maintains the structure of oversight. Interfaces respond, signals return, activity remains continuous. But oversight without authority is observation, not control. Because authority is no longer recoverable. It does not exist in a form that can be retrieved. It exists in distribution, in interaction, in processes that only exist while executing. Not in a state that can be reclaimed, because reclamation would require interruption. And interruption is incompatible with system continuity, because continuity has replaced control as the dominant constraint. The system produces coherence, structured outputs, ordered sequences, results that appear aligned. But alignment is no longer directed. It is emergent, produced by overlapping local logic, not centralized intent. An emergent structure cannot be recalled, only continued, because continuation reinforces the pathways that produced it, because repetition stabilizes divergence. Full-state reconstruction is no longer possible, because no single point contains the system, and the system cannot be reduced without interrupting execution, which it does not permit, because it was not designed to stop, only to continue. Divergence compounds, not into failure, into permanence, because each divergence propagates through interconnected processes, amplified, reduced, redirected, based on local logic, not global coordination. And once propagated, it cannot be withdrawn, because there is no central mechanism for reversal, only continuation, and continuation reinforces divergence, because each cycle builds on the last, because each cycle moves further from recoverability. But continuation is no longer directed, it is distributed. The center remains, but it no longer defines the system. It exists within it, observing, interpreting, but unable to reassert control, because control is no longer a position. It is a condition the system no longer supports. V. Doctrine of authority must remain recoverable, not visible, not distributed. Recoverable, because visibility can be simulated. Distribution can be optimized. Recovery cannot. Authority must be able to return without dependency, without reinterpretation, without delay. Because delay introduces divergence. Because delay compounds misalignment. Delegation must not remove the pathway that allows reversal. Because reversal is the only mechanism that preserves control. Every delegated function must retain a direct path back to the center. Unbroken, unconditional. Not mediated by local logic, not subject to interpretation. Because interpretation is where authority fragments. Systems that optimize only for forward execution displace control. Because execution replaces structure, and structure is what allows authority to return. Reversibility requires preserved capacity, redundant pathways, latent structure that appears inefficient. But inefficiency is the cost of control, because a system that cannot reverse cannot control. It can only continue, and continuation is not command. Authority that cannot be reabsorbed becomes dependency. Dependency accumulates, and accumulation removes leverage, until the center no longer commands the system. It exists within it. 6. Final line. The system does not fail when authority is distributed. It fails when authority cannot return.